Hi guys, today we'll be talking about aiming with torpedoes in World of Warships. Since I've heard that some of you still have a little bit of problems with that, this video should explain you the basics and maybe a little bit more. We're gonna be talking about how to tell if a ship should focus on torpedoing, then we're gonna go over basic principles of aiming with them, after which we're gonna go to detailed tactics and strategies to do it efficiently. And in the end, I'm gonna wrap it up with some common mistakes that you should avoid. The timestamps are gonna be in the bottom, so you can skip the intro if you already are a little bit more of experienced player. Okay, but not everyone watching this video is an experienced player that knows what torpedoes are. So first, I want to give some overview of them to the beginners. Torpedoes in this game is a kind of weapon that allows a ship to deal with enemy with large HP pools and generally big in size very quickly, as they can deal huge amounts of damage in a very short time. However, there are counterplays to them and they are not as consistent in terms of damage over time as guns are. Also, not every single ship is equipped with them and not every single ship should focus on dealing damage using mostly torpedoes. Majority of the ships in the game have main battery as their main source of damage, while leaving the torpedoes to emergency situations or just area of denial. To see if your ship has torpedoes at all, just go to your port, select the ship you want to check, and if under your captain there is gonna be torpedoes tab, that means the ship possesses torpedo tubes. Pressing that tab will reveal all the details about the torpedoes, such as the range, speed, damage, reload time, the amount of torpedo tubes you have on the ship, as well as your torpedo detectability. All those values vary from ship to ship, and to check if your ship should actually focus on them, you need to check some other characteristics of it as well. First, you need to check if your ship has different kind of armament that is going to be more effective. Such, for example, is in case of Harugumo, when you have very effective IGN torpedoes, however you don't really have a lot of them, but you have a lot of guns that are incredibly good at dealing with a lot of enemies. Ergo, you shouldn't really spec Harugumo into torpedoes. The same torpedoes are present on Shimakaze, a ship that has a lot of them, but in contrast to Harugumo doesn't really have great guns, meaning that this ship should focus on torpedoes. In terms of range, you want to check ship's concealment, as you want the torpedo range to exceed your ship concealment to be used efficiently. Last, what you want to check is torpedoes detectability. If your ship's torps are visible from above 2 kilometers, they're usually not gonna be as effective in terms of dealing damage as other torpedoes would be. Torpedoes also come in two variants. First, the standard torpedoes that hit everything and have mediocre detectability on average. And second kind, which is deep water torpedoes, which are the Pan-Asian gimmick, but that doesn't mean that only Pan-Asian ships have them. Deep water torpedoes are significantly harder to detect, whilst having very high alpha as well. But all of this comes at the price of not being able to hit destroyers, meaning that if you are playing as a destroyer and you see deep water torpedoes coming, they're not gonna be able to hit your ship, they're just gonna go right under you. There's an extra variant of deep water torpedoes, which is the super deep water torpedoes, which are present on very little ships, which most of them are copies of Asashio. Their extra property is being even more stealthy with even higher alpha, but they are also unable to hit cruisers, so they can only hit aircraft carriers and battleships. In terms of firing your torpedoes, in game itself, If your ship has torpedo tubes, on the bottom near all your armament, you're gonna notice the torpedoes and the designed bound key that allows you to switch to torpedo firing mode. Without going into settings, this should be bound to button number 3 on your keyboard. Pressing it will reveal your torpedo firing angles and how the torpedoes are actually turning. Pressing it will allow you to fire the torpedoes. You fire the torpedoes by pressing left mouse button, just like you do for your guns. And just like guns, torpedo tubes need to actually turn to the valid direction and have their angles. Torpedo tubes also have their dispersion, but in contrast to guns, you cannot really change it in any way or influence it in any way. It is there. The only way you can influence the dispersion of your torpedoes is by changing the mode they are in. Each ship that is equipped with torpedo tubes has 2 modes of firing them unless it's firing single ones, like for example Mutsu does. First, and the default mode that I highly recommend for new players is the narrow spread, which basically means that you fire torpedoes in a narrow cone. Second type you can select by again pressing the same button that's bound to your torpedo tubes. This is gonna be the wide spread. The wide spread means that the torpedoes are gonna go basically everywhere, and it's gonna be very difficult for you to hit one, but it will cover a larger area, meaning that if there's a lot of enemies, technically you're gonna hit some of them eventually. There's also one special mode of firing torpedoes that's not present on every single ship, and it's generally the gimmick of the UK tech tree, which is the single firing of the torpedoes, which basically means that except for normal standard narrow mode, you have access to firing them single one by one, meaning there is absolutely no dispersion in terms of firing the torps. Okay, with basic info about torpedoes behind us and how to actually launch them, let's go over how to take care of our enemies with them. But before we go into actually killing the enemies, let's quickly mention what tools enemies have to deal with us. The most effective tool of dealing with torpedoes is gonna be the hydroacoustic surge. Hydroacoustic surge is a consumable that for a long duration spots every single ship in the area as well as it spots torpedoes, meaning that if a ship has hydroacoustic surge active, it's gonna be significantly more difficult to actually score a hit with torpedo, because he's gonna know about it and gonna go for evasive maneuvering. Speaking of evasive maneuvering, we need to know enemies' movements before we choose a strategy on how to fire the torpedoes at them. If enemy will anticipate torpedoes coming, they're gonna try to move in a zigzagging pattern, since this is the most effective way of dodging the torpedoes while pushing. When enemies are kiting, it's borderline impossible for us to hit torpedoes efficiently, since they are gonna run out before they're gonna reach the enemy most of the time. However, we have a couple tools to help us with detecting changes in enemy movements and help us lead our torpedoes. This is the gray area that we see whenever we select torpedoes and an enemy. This gray area shows where our torpedoes should be fired to hit enemy ship at its current speed and direction. However, I want to mention that this gray area doesn't take into consideration the range of your torpedoes, meaning it's gonna show even though the torpedoes are most likely not gonna have enough range to reach the enemy. If enemies are far away and you're not sure if you're gonna have enough range for your torpedoes, you can actually use the gray area to check if the ship you're gonna fire torpedoes at is still gonna be in your torpedo range when they're gonna reach it. How to do that? On your minimap, you have a circle that indicates maximum range of your torpedoes, as well as you have a line that's coming straight out of enemy ship and the line that's coming out of wherever you are aiming. Just simply go on the gray area with your aiming reticle, then look at the minimap. If the point of crossing between enemy ship movement line and the line of your sight currently are gonna cross within the circle of your torpedo range, that means the torpedoes are gonna be still armed when they will reach the target. There are two basic schools of firing the Torps. First is creating wall of skill, which basically means that we're gonna cover large area with torpedoes that are right next to each other. This method is incredibly consistent at scoring singular hits, however is very difficult to actually eliminate an enemy straight away with it. The second method is stacking the torpedoes, which basically means that we're gonna fire them right after each other, covering very small area with dense amount of torpedoes, meaning that if we actually manage to predict enemy movement and hit them with such a thing, they are most likely going back to port. However, small changes in enemy movement might result in you hitting no torps whatsoever. Very often, when playing as a ship that's focused on torpedoes, you have more than 2 torpedo tubes, meaning what you can do is go for something in between, which is firing wall of skill with first 2 tubes and then using the third or the fourth one if you have them to fire in between, meaning that you create both wall of skill and stacked torpedoes, and the stacked ones is the ones when you think the enemy will actually be, meaning that if he actually starts dodging and performing invasive maneuvers, you're most likely gonna score 1 hit. But if he doesn't and moves in a straight line because he considers dodging to be a suggestion, well, you most likely send him back to port. Okay, but which strategy should I take depending on enemy movement? Well, enemies do not really have much choice for movement and choke points. This is where the stacking of torpedoes should be the most effective. On open water, enemies will have a lot of area to maneuver, so wall of skill. But if enemy is heavily maneuvering whilst pushing, you want to go for the mixed strategy. The mixed strategy is also extremely efficient at scoring hits at enemies that are committed to the turn, because they're gonna be still dodging your allies, right? If you notice that the gray area is shifting drastically, that means enemy wants to commit into a 180 turn. If it happens that during that turn enemy is gonna be broadsiding to you, you want to fire the torps towards where the gray area is changing and slightly to the direction of the enemy. This way, if enemy stops during the turn, you're gonna have at least 1 torpedo set coming that way. But if he is still gonna be committed into it, well, he's gonna be forced to eat all the torpedoes or your allies' shells, meaning that he's most likely going back to port. Positioning is also a very important factor. The most efficient way of hitting the most torpedoes at enemy is when you're to enemy's side, when they are pushing towards your side of the map. But you don't necessarily need to force it. What's most important about positioning is staying undetected. If enemy doesn't know about your presence, they won't anticipate your torpedoes to come from that direction, meaning they will lower their guard and be more vulnerable for you to punish them. Just like in this Shimakaza game, when the last time I was detected by an enemy was when I was fighting this Shima at the start of the game over here. So I was free to get close to enemy aircraft carrier on the other side of the map. because who would predict that this Shimakaze went that far? And even though I could technically fire at the enemy CV and farm it with guns, I didn't, and that was the correct choice because I didn't show myself, ergo enemy didn't know he is supposed to dodge until it was too late. This is incredibly important, especially for destroyers, but not only. Torpedo-based cruisers should also try to fire their torpedoes from angles enemy won't expect while still in dark, but they can also use their guns. So they should fire the torpedoes, reposition to different angle, and open up. Therefore, enemy is gonna expect danger coming from where you've started firing. So they're gonna try to maneuver in such a way to dodge the torpedoes as if they are coming directly from where you're shooting. However, they are coming completely from different angle, meaning that you can easily eliminate them out of the game by pretending to fire the torpedoes from different position. The baiting strategy is generally pretty good for ships with bigger concealment that still focus on torpedoes. However, it has one major downside. If enemy is too dumb to actually start dodging or trying to shoot at you and will just ignore everything and tunnel vision on some other ally, you might as well just do absolutely nothing because the torpedoes are gonna miss. It happened to me, it can happen to anyone. Other more advanced strategies of firing the torpedoes are pre-torping, meaning that you fire the torpedoes at choke points and key areas that you know enemy wants to take, to either deny them because they're gonna try to avoid the torps, therefore they're not gonna go there, and then you can contest that area, or to score hits at whatever ship that is gonna try it. This is what I call the denial torps as well, or throw them to control an area. For example, in this clip, when I play as a Yodo that's I spec into torpedoes, there is a large portion of the map that is currently contested, but it's contested by small ships that I do not really know the position of. So instead of just trying to go there and gun them down, I also fire my torpedo tubes in that direction. So whenever they're gonna be, there's a small chance enemy might actually run into them, which actually happened in this clip, and it got us a kill. This strategy is much more efficient when you're playing something with very low reload on torpedoes and, for example, RPF that tells you that the direction of the closest enemy. You can just fire your torpedoes at that direction and maybe that guy is gonna run into them. It's just incredibly inconsistent method, but it leads to some funny moments. When playing in Division, for example, it's great to try to cross-torp enemy, meaning that one person fires the torps from the side while the other fires the torps from the front. The one firing the torps from the front needs to fire them in mixed spread so that the enemy has no area of turning while the other stacks them. By doing this, enemy has no point where he can turn because he's gonna eat torpedoes that are wall of skilled from the front, but if he doesn't, he's gonna eat the torpedoes that are stacked from the side. Either way, he's gonna die. However, this is very difficult to pull off since you need good coordination between teammates. This is why I said that it should be done in divisions most of the time. Okay, but we're mostly talking about the ships that have torpedoes as their main armament. What about those that do not really focus on them but have them present? Well, those fall into two categories. First are the ships with very short range torpedoes. Being pushed by bigger ship, usually for a cruiser that hacks islands, results in death. However, since he possesses short range torpedoes, can use them as kind of an equalizer, meaning that if enemy pushes you, it's great to use them just to deal with enemy point blank. You can also use the short range torpedoes at rolling distances to push an enemy from behind the island, but the torpedo uses for those generally end there. You have one torpedo tube per side on average if you have ship like that, and it's basically, well, brawl-in tool. You need to take into consideration that even though the torpedoes have short range and kind of decent speed, they still need to arm, meaning that there is a small distance from your ship in which when you fire the torps and they're gonna hit an enemy, they're gonna deal absolutely no damage. For ships like, for example, Yoshino or Zao, where you have a lot of torpedoes, especially Zao recently got buffed in terms of torpedo angles, but you shouldn't really focus on torpedoes. It's great to use them as sort of area denial tool when you basically just throw them towards the enemy to slow them down and force them to maneuver, or when you're being pushed like in the previous case. However, just spamming them randomly on choke points may result in you getting a hit or two, which is a nice addition to your damage, but you shouldn't really care that much about doing that. You should focus on your main source of damage. Okay, what are the most common mistakes in terms of using the torpedoes? First is forcing yourself to use them from maximum distance. You should get relatively close to enemy so that your torpedoes have enough range. If enemy starts to run away, they should still be able to catch that. Second is the opposite. It is overcommitting to a torp push, which means you get much too close and get detected by the enemy, meaning that they're gonna expect the torps coming and you probably won't score many hits. Third is giving away info about your presence by, for example, smoking up and shooting at enemy. Best and most efficient way to fire the torps is to stay dark, because they won't dodge what they don't know is coming. Fourth is using the torpedoes straight away after they get off cooldown. Trigger discipline is actually very important, and firing torpedoes teaches patience. Wait for a perfect opportunity, as very often you're gonna have a lot of perfect opportunities when you're gonna have torps on reload. Last is, do not forget that other enemies might also possess tools to spot your torpedoes, or might just swim by your torpedoes when you're firing them at a different target, meaning that all the enemy team is gonna be aware that they are coming and probably go for evasive maneuvers. To check for enemies possessing hydroacoustic surge, for example, just simply press tab and while holding it, go over the enemy ships with your mouse. It's gonna show you all the possible maximum values of enemy, but also all the possible consumables that they might have. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope I made much more stuff for you clear in terms of firing the torpedoes. And if you like and want more content like this, just simply leave down a like and consider subscribing. It's free and you can always unsubscribe, right? It's been Senpai Silent. See ya next time.